This is the IBJ podcast for the week of May 18th, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Krieg DeVault. I'm Mason King.
Hoosiers, it was 8 weeks ago when I first spoke to you about the unprecedented scourge attacking our state and the steps that we would take to fight it. For these past weeks, I've said that we were only at the beginning of what would be a long race, and there are many miles to go. Today, I can report that thanks to the discipline and actions of 6.7 million Hoosiers, we are ready to move ahead in a measured way.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. That, of course, is Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb, and that snippet of audio is from his highly anticipated announcement on May the 1st, laying out his basic timetable for loosening and then ending the restrictions of the coronavirus quarantine. If you just count the people who are watching online via streaming services, he had an audience of more than 500,000 people. Holcomb has put himself in the public spotlight, or if you will, the crosshairs of public opinion, nearly every weekday for the last 2 months, hosting press conferences about the state's response to the coronavirus crisis. It is not an easy job, as the governor and his staff are tasked every day with delivering bad news, addressing questions that have no easy answer, if any answer, and asking residents to make difficult sacrifices to beat an enemy we don't totally understand. This also happens to be an election year. On one hand, Holcomb is blessed with the opportunity to show voters how he can handle a dire crisis without having to spend a dime from his immense campaign war chest. On the other hand, if he makes an obvious mistake or miscalculates how quickly the state should reopen, it'll be in front of millions of voters, each with a keen interest in the outcome. Now, the election is more than 5 months away still, and a lot can happen. If nothing else, the public's coronavirus fatigue could make them yearn for a new face. And his Democratic challenger, Dr. Woody Myers, has a resume that seems tailor-made for this moment, with an elite medical degree and years of experience in both public health policy and corporate decision-making. So for this week's edition of the podcast, we're examining the political risks and potential rewards of managing the state's response to COVID-19 in real time and in the public eye nearly every day. My guests are IBJ reporter Lindsay Erdotti, who has written about this topic in the latest issue of IBJ, and political scientist Robert Dion. I'll give him a proper introduction in a moment. Here's our conversation. So joining us in the IBJ podcast virtual studio is Robert Dion, an associate political science professor at the University of Evansville. Robert, thank you for making time to share your thoughts today.
Glad to be here.
And also joining us is IBJ reporter Lindsay Erdotti, who covers government and politics. She's also the author of our weekly newsletter, The Rundown, which covers government and politics from a local, state, and national perspective. You can subscribe by going to ibj.com/newsletters. Lindsay, thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just get right into it. Let's establish where the governor's race is right now between Eric Holcomb and Woody Myers. Who is leading and by how much?
If the question is where the race is now, I think it's fair to say it's where it was before at the beginning of the year. When this election year began, Governor Holcomb, the incumbent Republican in a Republican state, who is not unpopular, was the prohibitive favorite. He had more money than the other candidates who were looking at it. And all things being equal, you would expect that a reasonably popular incumbent Republican governor with lots of money would be the leader. And even though we're living through really unusual times, to say the least, everything's been turned upside down. But I'm not sure that the election outlook has been turned upside down to the extent that he's in grave danger of being defeated.
Yeah, one of the persistent digs against Governor Holcomb is that he has poor name recognition in his own state. I think even less than a year ago, a poll showed that nearly 30% of Hoosier voters said they'd never even heard of him. Now, I think that is a potential weakness that the right candidate might exploit, but how has his name recognition improved in the last year?
Yeah, his name recognition has certainly gone up with those daily press conferences. I mean, they've been going on essentially every day since mid-March, and they're streamed on TV, they're streamed online, and he's got an hour of TV time where he's talking to the public. And so that definitely helps him get more name recognition. And more recent polls have shown that his unknown portion is not as high. So that would also suggest, that it's gotten a little bit better.
Now, I've only watched these on Facebook Live. Are they also on television?
Yes, they're also on local TV stations have been broadcasting them, and certain local media like the Indianapolis Star, for example, streams it on their website. So, the governor's office shared the viewership numbers that they have just from their direct link and from Facebook Live. And that has ranged from 68,000 on a random day to 545,000 on May 1st, which was the day he announced the back on track reopening plan, and had kind of teased it all week. So it makes sense that that day was so much higher. But I mean, it's safe to say tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people, are watching this.
He's on public radio down here, so I've not seen them on television, but I've heard him on the radio. And it's not just that he's reaching people, but he's making news. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but the governor doesn't make news every day. I mean, the average Hoosier does not jump out of bed and wonder what Eric Holcomb is up to. But when we're in a pandemic and sheltering in place and wondering about whether we should leave the house, and it's up to the governor during a public health crisis, all of a sudden it becomes something that everybody really does want to hear. So he's got a captive audience, and that's a world apart from the way he began his term. I don't think it's unfair to suggest that Eric Holcomb is sort of the accidental governor. He ran for office down here and failed for state legislature. He ran for the Senate and couldn't get out of the starting gate. And then he sort of backed into the lieutenant governor position. And then all of a sudden he had a whirlwind campaign as the default candidate for governor. So you're absolutely right. Most people don't have a firm opinion about him or lots of years of understanding of his profile. He's always sort of been a behind the scenes party leader, but he has come out from behind the curtain in this instance, and loads and loads and loads of Hoosiers have seen and heard their governor in action. It's interesting to look at our neighboring states because all governors everywhere are making news every day, and they have an audience that is just hanging on every word. And in some cases, governors have really just fundamentally transformed their relationship with the people and become overnight sensations. North of us, you've got Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, and then the brand new Democratic governor of Kentucky down here, Andy Beshear, and the Republican Ohio governor. All three of those have achieved a national profile and really stratospheric public approval. Again, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I think Eric Holcomb has performed quite well, but I don't know that he's become a national star or that he's become a superstar among Hoosiers even. Certainly when you compare him to Gretchen Whitmer or Andy Beshear. And I don't know exactly why that's the case. It can't be party, because Mike DeWine, who's kind of a shrinking violet, really, and poor man fades into the background in any room he walks into. But all of a sudden, people have a different opinion about him. And all of us who are a little older know that that's what often happens in a crisis. There's a thing in public opinion we call the rally around the flag effect. We remember that George W. Bush was sort of a hapless president who didn't get a majority when he was elected. He was elected in a recount. On September 10th, half of Americans thought he was doing an unexceptional job as president. And on September 12th, 90% approval he got. So the circumstances can really cause people to grasp onto their leaders and change the esteem that they have for them. And that's happened around us, but it hasn't really happened in Indiana.
Now, we know what happened with the Bush presidency, obviously, at the end, where he was, I think, at a 25% approval rating. Is there a reason to believe that Governor Holcomb right now is enjoying an artificial bump because of the circumstances, but very well could be seen in a dimmer light later on?
I think part of that will depend on what we see happen over the next 6 months. Does the reopening plan go well? Do we have another wave of this in the fall? What happens with unemployment and the economy? I think all of those things can kind of factor into it. right now, as far as we know, one of the recent polls showed that 63% of people approve of the way he's been handling the pandemic so far. I mean, so that looks pretty good for him, especially given, like we said earlier, he was already sitting in a pretty safe Republican reelection bid. But again, there is the unknown factor of what happens in the fall, because November is still a little ways away.
All right, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
Okay, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast. We're talking with reporter Lindsay Erdoty and political scientist Robert Dion about how the coronavirus crisis has put Governor Eric Holcomb in the spotlight on a daily basis and whether that could help or hurt his re-election campaign. I know that when we talk about comparisons to the other governors, at least early on, I think that there was a sense that he was kind of waiting for the other guys to weigh in before he decided to do anything. In Indiana, is that necessarily a bad thing to be overshadowed by, somebody next door? We are a pretty conservative group of folks.
I saw this week that we got positive coverage in the New York Times for being data-driven in our approach. And my goodness, I can't believe that that's newsworthy. I mean, the idea that he's been cautious and careful and data-driven and taking advice from experts, I think all of that speaks well. Caution is a good thing. I think Holcomb has acquitted himself pretty well. But I take Lindsay's point that we're talking now in mid-May. We haven't even had the primary yet. And anything could happen between now and then. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you a crazy story about New Jersey that seems to have nothing to do with what we're talking about. Back in the 90s, I used to teach in New York, so I followed this back then. Back in the 90s, the Democratic governor raised taxes in New Jersey, and he wasn't on the ballot that year, but Bill Bradley was, the popular Republican senator, and he almost lost. I mean, it was desperately close. Christine Todd Whitman almost defeated him. Bradley was kind of stunned, and he said, "What the heck did I do?" And the voters were just in a bad mood. There's every reason to believe that voters are going to be in a sour mood and an uncertain and an uneasy mood when November comes, because we are going to see stratospheric unemployment rates, a shocking death toll. It's already shocking. I mean, if not one more person dies, this has really been a really, really bad thing. It's not at all clear that anybody's going to blame Eric Holcomb for that, because God knows it's not his fault. But if the voters are in a bad mood, the impulse or the reflex is just to punish the incumbent, irrespective of, the facts or the details about his or her performance.
And I would just say that not getting the attention that other governors have gotten isn't exactly a problem for Holcomb, because he answers to the voters in Indiana. He doesn't answer to voters in Ohio or in all these other states. So if people in Ohio or Michigan don't know what he's doing, that doesn't really impact him in his reelection bid.
Let's look at the alternative, which is Dr. Woody Myers. So if you're a state Democratic official, you probably felt pretty fortunate that Myers was the opponent, because he seems like he would be the right guy for this kind of crisis. He's a medical doctor. He received his medical degree from Harvard. He was Indiana's state health commissioner under both Governor Robert Orr and Democratic Governor Evan Bayh. Do you think he's been able to take advantage of this expertise?
No. The Democrats I've talked to agree with what you just said and have stressed to me, on paper, he's the best candidate we could have right now. But then you ask, okay, what you just asked, has he taken advantage of it? Has he done enough with it? And they won't say yes to that question.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation, that he seems tailor-made for the moment. And even the mere idea that he was named by Bob Orr, who used to be mayor of Evansville way back when and is a an old guard Republican who's still very highly thought of down here, indicates that he can work across the aisle in the service of evidence and facts and data. He's got a stellar resume, but how you intrude on the governor's bully pulpit right now, or the overarching news about, restaurants opening or whatnot. And it's very easy to disappear from the scene. This is not a traditional primary in any sense. There's nobody out on the hustings. Sometimes it could actually blow back on you if you try to inject partisan politics into this. And I think there's been some of that on both sides that have sort of deteriorated the discussion, but just the idea of focusing on the election is not where voters' heads are right now. I think they will be by the fall. And Dr. Myers, one hopes, will be well placed to offer an alternative, but it hasn't happened yet.
How's he doing on fundraising? It is a question of just not having a big enough megaphone?
His fundraising has not been great, if you ask how Democrats feel about it. Right now, or at least at the end of the quarter, he had about $22,000 cash on hand, and that's compared to Holcomb, who has more than $7.1 million in the bank right now. So that's a big gap. And especially when you need to be thinking, in the future about running ads and getting on TV and getting media out there, $22,000 isn't really going to get you anywhere versus, Holcomb's on TV every day, not spending that campaign money on that, just being able to talk to the public about everything that's going on, and he'll have money to run ads in the fall.
I agree. And there's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding about the role that money plays in elections. And it's unfair to suggest that somebody needs to have as much or more. Not necessarily. There are other factors at work, and sometimes no amount of money can save you when you're going down. I always tell students that you don't necessarily have to have more money, but you have to have enough money to run a credible statewide campaign where you use all the opportunities to convey your message and compare yourself to your opponent. And I think anybody would agree that $22,000 is not what you need to run a statewide campaign. Some of that money is going to come, whether it's from homegrown donors or from the Democratic Governors Association or what have you. So he'll get more, but this is not the strong candidacy we saw when John Gregg ran a couple times, and he was pulling in loads and loads of cash, more than the other party for a while.
Is there anything that Myers could be doing better that just is not expensive?
Some people I talked to suggested different things, they'd like to see him doing, like he could have been doing press availabilities after Governor Holcomb's press availabilities every day, just to get his voice in a story, or presenting different plans that he would do or how he would do it better. And he has done some of that. He has had some virtual press conferences. He has talked to us a little bit. He did one in-person event where he went and got tested for COVID-19 and invited the press there. But then, at that event said that he wasn't going to share his results. And I think that event kind of unraveled compared to what the campaign was hoping for with that. People I talked to for this story, think he can be doing a lot more, even with the little money he has right now. And I think they would like to see him doing a lot more fundraising. And talking to the campaign this week, they've named Linda Lawson as the lieutenant governor candidate with him. And they seem to have some hope that she runs in different circles within the party and can bring in, different donors and different supporters in that way, and kind of hopefully bring, more life and more support to the campaign. But, that just happened within a week, so we'll see how that goes.
We made mention of this a little bit earlier. It's probably impossible to make all of your constituents happy during a pandemic, and Holcomb has been criticized by folks who either think the pandemic has been overblown or that businesses need to be given free rein as soon as possible. There have been two protests of pretty significant size, one on April 18th outside the governor's mansion, and the other on May 1st outside the State House.
In response to when he was asked about the protests and kind of what he thought about them, he kind of had an response that didn't really take a position on it. He said people, it's their right to be out there and to protest and to have those opinions, but he would hope that people are being smart about social distancing and staying 6 feet apart from each other when possible. And he didn't really criticize them, and he didn't really support them either in his response to it. And I think when he's been asked about, why has he kept businesses closed, he points out all the data that he's looking at and all the reasons why he's done it, and kind of tries to make his case for it. And I don't think that those protests have particularly made him question whether or not his decisions have been right.
Yeah, I agree. Indiana's got a pretty strong libertarian streak and not a really deep love of government and government overreach. But I still think those protests have been pretty modest. In my view, it's a fringe element. Anytime I see a sign comparing Eric Holcomb to Hitler, I know I'm not dealing with, rational people. So in my view, it's not a widely held view.
And these protests are not unique to Indiana. These protests have happened in plenty of other states with people upset for the very same reasons with their governors. And it doesn't matter if the governor is a Democrat or a Republican. It's a bipartisan frustration that things are shut down.
My thanks again to Lindsay Erdotti and Robert Dion. Lindsay's story in the latest issue of IBJ folds in the viewpoints of several other political scientists and strategists. You can look for it at ibj.com. And there are a few other stories I'd like to draw to your attention. As you know, Indianapolis has built itself over the last 2 decades into a major player in the hospitality industry. But right now, our hotels are lucky if 20% of their rooms are occupied on any given night. Mickey Shuey reviews mortgage records for some of the largest hotels in central Indiana to determine which ones are in danger of missing debt payments if business doesn't improve significantly in the second half of the year. Also, on the topic of mortgages, Susan Orr reports that rock-bottom 30-year mortgage rates for homes have inspired a tidal wave of refinancing. And Greg Andrews reveals how a pair of insurance industry veterans is making a play to seize control of Carmel-based Protective Insurance Corporation, one of Central Indiana's oldest public companies. You can read these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ, or, of course, online at ibj.com. Much of our coverage of the coronavirus crisis can be accessed for free on the website for all readers, and that includes our continuously updated digest of all the latest news. It's called The Latest, and you'll see it on the IBJ homepage. And remember, for unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content from today, yesterday, the previous economic crisis, just hit the subscribe button. Hey, thanks for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there. We'll be back again next week.